Hello, 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 hello. For this video, I'm gonna do a mixture of soft speaking and whispers, and I'm gonna be reading some more philosophy today. I wanted to read The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, and I probably won't get through all of it, so it'll just be a selection, but maybe I can make more videos because it's quite a long essay. But I remember reading it during my freshman year of college, and I took an intro philosophy course. This is one of the essays that we read. For me, I found it completely fascinating. And I really fell in love with philosophy during that first course, during my first semester of my freshman year of college, and decided pretty early on that I wanted to major in it. So this kind of, played a role in my trajectory somehow. But I haven't actually returned to Camus, or at least this particular essay. I read The Stranger. I think most people read that in high school, but I didn't end up reading that until college one summer, so I read that, but I haven't actually returned to this particular essay, so I'm really interested. I recently watched a YouTube video on Camus, a YouTube video on Camus, and kind of remembered why I found it so intriguing and enticing the first time I read it, and I want to revisit it. So hopefully you guys also find this interesting. So without further ado, I'm gonna get to the reading. So this is The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, and the first section is called An Absurd Reasoning, with the subsection titled Absurdity and Suicide. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games one must first answer, and if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. If I ask myself how to judge that this question is more urgent than that, I reply that one judges by the actions it entails. I have never seen anyone die for the ontological argument. Galileo, who held a scientific truth of great importance, abjured it with the greatest ease as soon as it endangered his life. In a certain sense, he did right. That truth was not worth the stake. Whether the earth or the sun revolves around the other is a matter of profound indifference. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusion that give them a reason for living. What is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. How to answer it? On all essential problems, I mean thereby those that run the risk of leading to death, or those that intensify the passion of living. On all essential problems, I mean thereby those that run the risk of leading to death, or those that intensify the passion of living. There are probably but two methods of thought, the method of La Palisse and the method of Don Quixote. Solely the balance between evidence and lyricism can allow us to achieve simultaneously emotion and lucidity. In a subject at once so humble and so heavy with emotion, the learned and classical dialectic must yield, one can see, to a more modest attitude of mind, deriving at one and the same time from common sense and understanding. Suicide has never been dealt with except as a social phenomenon. On the contrary, we are concerned here, at the outset, with the relationship between the individual thought and suicide. An act like this is prepared within the silence of the heart, and is a great work of art. The man himself is ignorant of it. One evening he pulls the trigger or jumps. Of an apartment building manager who had killed himself, I was told that he thought he had lost his daughter 5 years before, that be bad changed greatly since, and that experience had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. Society has but little connection with such beginnings. The worm is in the man's heart. That is where it must be sought. One must follow and understand this fatal game that leads from lucidity in the face of existence to flight from light. There are many causes for suicide, and generally the most obvious ones are not the most powerful. Rarely is suicide committed, yet the hypothesis is not excluded through reflection. What sets off the crisis is almost always unverifiable. Newspapers often speak of personal sorrows or of incurable illness. These explanations are plausible, but one would have to know whether a friend of the desperate man had not that very day addressed him indifferently. He is the guilty one, for that is enough to precipitate all the rancors and all the boredom still in suspension. But if it is hard to fix the precise instant, the subtle step when the mind opted for death, it is easier to deduce from the act itself the consequences it implies. In a sense, and as in melodrama, killing yourself amounts to confessing. It is confessing that life is too much for you and that you do not understand it. Let's not go too far in such analogies, however, but rather return to everyday words. It is merely confessing that is not worth the trouble. Living, naturally, is never easy. You continue making the gestures commanded by existence for many reasons, the first of which is habit. Dying voluntarily implies that you've recognized, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. What, then, is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of the sleep necessary to life? A world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. But the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and this life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. All healthy men, having thought of their own suicide, it can be seen, without further explanation, that there is a direct connection between this feeling and the longing for death. The subject of this essay is precisely this relationship between the absurd and suicide, the exact degree to which the suicide is a solution to the absurd. The principle can be established that for a man who does not cheat, what he believes to be true must determine his action. Belief in the absurdity of existence must then dictate his conduct. It is legitimate to wonder, clearly, and without false pathos, whether a conclusion of this importance requires forsaking as rapidly as possible an incomprehensible condition. I am speaking, of course, of men inclined to be in harmony with themselves. Stated clearly, this problem may seem both simple and insoluble, but it is wrongly assumed that the simple questions involve answers that are no less simple, and that evidence implies evidence. A priori, in reversing the terms of the problem, just as one does or does not kill oneself, it seems that there is but two philosophical solutions, either yes or no. This would be too easy, but allowance must be made for those who, without concluding, continue questioning. Here I am only slightly indulging in irony. This is the majority. I notice also that those who answer no act as if they thought yes. As a matter of fact, if I accept the Nietzschean criterion, I think that yes, in one way or another. On the other hand, it often happens that those who commit suicide were assured of its meaning of life, were assured of the meaning of life. These contradictions are constant. It may even be said that they have never been so keen as on this point, where, on the contrary, logic seems so desirable. It is a commonplace to compare philosophical theories and the behavior of those who profess them, but it must be said that of the thinkers who have refused a meaning of life, none except Kirillov, who belongs to literature, Peregrinos, who is born of legend, and Jules Lequier, who belongs to hypothesis, admitted his logic to the point of refusing that life. Schopenhauer is often cited as a fit subject for laughter because he praised suicide while seated at a well-set table. This is no subject for joking. That way of not taking the tragic seriously is not so grievous, but it helps to judge a man. In the face of such contradictions and obscurities, we must conclude that there is no relationship between the opinion one has about life and the act of one commits to leave it. Let us not exaggerate in this direction. In a man's attachment to life, there is something stronger than all the ills in the world. The body's judgment is as good as the mind's, and the body shrinks from annihilation. We get into the habit of living before acquiring the habit of thinking. In that race which daily hastens us towards death, the body maintains its irreparable lead. In short, the essence of that contradiction lies in what I shall call the act of eluding, because it is both less and more than diversion in the Pascalian sense. Eluding is the invariable game. The typical act of eluding, the fatal evasion that constitutes the third theme of this essay, is hope. hope of another life one must deserve, or trickery of those who live not for life itself, but for some great idea that will transcend it, refine it, give it meaning, and betray it. Thus, everything contributes to spreading confusion. Hitherto, it has not been wasted effort. People have played on words and pretended to believe that refusing to grant a meaning to life necessarily leads to declaring that it is not worth living. In truth, there is no necessary common measure between these two judgments. One merely has to refuse to be misled by the confusions, divorces, and inconsistencies previously pointed out. One must brush everything aside and go straight to the real problem. One kills oneself because life is not worth living. That is certainly a truth, yet an unfruitful one, because it is a truism. But does that insult to existence, that flat denial in which it is plunged, come from the fact that it has no meaning? Does its absurdity require one to escape it through hope or suicide? This is what we must be clarified, hunted down, and elucidated while brushing aside all the rest. Does the absurd dictate death? This problem must be given priority over the others, outside all methods of thought and all exercises of the disinterested mind. Shades of meaning, contradictions, the psychology that an objective mind can always introduce into all problems, have no place in this pursuit, and this passion it calls simply for an unjust, in other words, logical thought. That is not easy. It is always easy to be logical. It is almost impossible to be logical to the bitter end. Men who die by their own hand consequently follow to its conclusion their emotional inclination. Reflection on suicide gives me an opportunity to raise the only problem to interest me. Is there a logic to the point of death? I cannot know unless I pursue, without reckless passion, in the sole light of evidence, the reasoning of which I am here suggesting the source. This is what I call an absurd reasoning. Many have begun it. I do not yet know whether or not they kept to it. When Karl Jaspers, revealing the impossibility of constituting the world as a unity, exclaims, "This limitation leads me to myself, where I can no longer withdraw behind an objective point of view that I am merely representing, where neither I myself nor the existence of others can any longer become an object for me." He is evoking, after many others, those waterless deserts where thought reaches its confines. After many others, yes indeed, but how eager they were to get out of them. At that last crossroad where the thought hesitates, many men have arrived, and even some of the humblest. They then abdicated what was most precious to them, their life. Others, principles of the minds, abdicated likewise, but they initiated the suicide of their thought in its purest revolt. The real effort is to stay there, rather, insofar that is possible, and to examine closely the odd vegetation of those distant regions. Tenacity and acumen are privileged spectators of this inhuman show in which absurdity, hope, and death carry on their dialogue. The mind can then analyze the figures of that elementary yet subtle dance before illustrating them and reliving them itself. So that's the end of the first section, which seems like a good place to stop. The next section is titled Absurd Walls. So if you like Camus, then I can keep going with this, keep posting these to YouTube or Patreon, and I probably will be doing it in one of those locations either way. So if you have a strong preference, let me know. But I look forward to seeing you in more videos soon. And please comment if you have any thoughts about the philosophy we were reading. I think I'm gonna add some of my own thoughts into a text when I'm editing and put them in the video. So if you have any responses to any of my thoughts or from the text itself, just feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to have a